Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where I talk with the world's leading thinkers, planners, and doers who are helping to build great companies in their own way. We learn how the work they're doing is creating an impact and get to know a little bit more about them and what makes them tick. This episode is brought to you by Evolution Partners, where we help leaders to confidently build enduring great companies using our proven, structured, strategic planning process that ensures you build and execute the right plan. Check us out at evolutionpartners.com.au. Also, you can check out the books Made to Thrive about how to be a great CEO, the 5 roles of a CEO, and Onboarded about onboarding new hires more effectively and faster. And then finally, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better, about building a better business. Today's guest is Mark Butler, an expert working at the intersection of psychology and performance. With more than 25 years in corporate environments and 15 years in clinical practice, Mark has helped leaders and teams operate at their best under pressure while reducing the mental health risks that quietly undermine performance. Mark is known for turning complex psychological insights, I'll get that right, into practical tools leaders can use immediately. He's the author of Up Yours, a guide to radical self-care for leaders, and he has an upcoming book, What's Up?, which focuses on how to have critical conversations during uncertain times. His work sits at the forefront of burnout prevention, psychosocial hazard compliance, and sustainable high performance, all crucial issues for mid-market owner-led companies today. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much indeed, Brad. It's lovely to be here.
A fascinating resume, really focusing on what is, I guess, becoming more and more of an issue that society shines a light on, and especially, I would say, in the business world, where it used to be a bit of a case of toughen up and I'll rest when I'm dead, and don't worry about if you're in trouble. Just get on and do it.
At home. Yeah. We can't separate them in the same way that it's hard to separate work and home now, you know.
Exactly. So maybe you could kick us off. Just give us a little bit more info behind the bio, perhaps. Tell us, how did you end up in this situation today?
Okay. Well, I suppose the first thing probably to point out is 25 years corporate and commercial experience and 15 years clinical. They ran side by side. Don't add those together.
I thought that.
Yeah. He's doing well for 80, isn't he? No, so I experienced burnout myself, and at a time when I don't know that we had a phrase for it. You know what I mean? It was a very early 2000s. But I was just stretched too thin. And I did what so many leaders do. I was more concerned about my people and less about myself. And so, just bouncing into this idea of burnout for a second, I've always said that someone else will spot the burnout in you before you'll see it in yourself. And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, our self-critic won't allow us to have something that's less than sort of, weak. So we give ourselves a really hard time for having it. And so we will make excuses for all of the different things that are happening to us. Yeah. And to the extent then that we're very often the last person to know that we're burning out. It's other folks will see it in us. And especially as leaders, you got to hope that your team is one that will point it out and say they're concerned. Not all will, you know what I mean? But the leader then that puts themselves first is the one that's going to struggle the hardest if they're not aware of what's happening for themselves. And like a little microcosm of that might be, I'm very often asked the question, so how would leaders know when they're burning out, or what would you expect to see? And very often frustration will kick in when a leader is either overwhelmed, too much on their plate, or they're exhausted. And so I'll often ask a leader, if you're getting frustrated or snappy or angry or with your people, who notices it first? Is it you or is it them? And that's a really interesting insight into what their emotional intelligence level is like and what their burnout level is like, quite frankly. So it's very often difficult for us to spot it. So I found myself burning out, trying to look after my team. And as we just said, work-life balance was a lovely idea once upon a time. But quite frankly, I think in today's world, particularly in the knowledge industries that we'd be in, we kind of can't, leave it behind. So I don't talk about work-life balance. I mean, the
Mm.
idea of balance being there's only one sweet spot anyway, and if it's not exactly there, then it's out of balance and therefore
Yeah.
wrong. And I don't think we're in a world where we can think like that. I think it's work-life integration or work-family integration, something along those lines that shows how we can blend it in a healthy and careful way.
I feel like burnout and performance
Mm.
operate on somewhat of a bell curve where there is an optimal state, and you can have less performance
Mm-hmm.
than the optimal state on the left-hand side of the bell curve. But then there is really a law of diminishing returns,
Yeah.
perhaps, the more that you go to the right, where you might be getting more and more burnt out. How do you know when to talk to someone about that? Because
Yeah.
you said that someone will notice it before you notice it yourself. So if there's someone, how do you know when to pipe up and actually start the conversation with someone?
I guess we're probably talking about psychological safety now. You know, in a
Yeah.
team, Amy Edmondson, Timothy R. Clark's work. You know, it's okay to not be okay, kind of thing, and we have to be able to speak up when we can. So this, you know, we're tapping into this idea of stigma and shame that people feel that I can't keep up, I'm not good enough, I'm letting the team down, etc. And that's even worse if it's a leader feeling those things. And so, you know, we'll make up every excuse to protect ourselves from having to think like that. But it's something that we have to be mindful of, and that stigma and shame. It's an evolutionary thing. It's a throwback to survival of the fittest in the pack. You know, the weak get left behind. All of that. I mean, to my mind, there's an evolutionary part of that. Professor Gordon Parker, University of New South Wales, and colleagues wrote a fabulous book called "Beating Burnout," and there's a tagline, can't remember it, but they use a really good metaphor for this idea of burning out versus burnt out. And they talk about a candle. So a flickering candle in the wind is in fear of blowing out, of being extinguished. So what do you do with that? Well, you protect the flame, don't you? And it comes back. But if the candle is extinguished, now you have a few questions. Okay, well, do I get a bigger candle? Do I move it somewhere else? Do I get a second candle? Do I light it? Do I bother lighting it again? Should I just leave it extinguished? There's a whole host of different things.
Yeah.
So it's a question of where along the spectrum are they? And like you were just saying, Brad, that bell curve is a beautiful image. I often use one like a violin string. If it's not under enough tension, it's utterly useless. It's just flopping around.
Yeah.
Too much tension and it snaps. But when you're in that right spot, when you're in that optimal spot, then you get beautiful production from it, you know. And I think it's the same with burnout. The traditional model of burnout talked about 3 pillars, and anyone in your audience that has an interest in burnout will know what the World Health Organization was talking about. You know, that they talk about exhaustion as one of the pillars. And that's absolutely true. But it could be mental, physical, or emotional. To my mind, emotional exhaustion is going to be the one that sticks around.
Yeah.
Physical or mental exhaustion can recover with a break and a bit of a rest. Emotional exhaustion, not so much. Needs a
Yeah.
little bit more intervention than just, you know, taking a week off. It doesn't really do anything at all for burnout. But then they talked about the second one was they used the phrase efficacy is the second pillar. And to me, that's always been just such an academic word. It should be wearing a lab coat or a tweed jacket or something. And
Yeah.
essentially what it means is our ability to do our best work. But the word to someone who's burning out just doesn't mean anything, you know,
Yeah.
so it's not going to sort of resonate, if you like.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the third pillar was what they call cynicism. Now, from my clinical experience, cynicism is an externalization of what we're feeling. We're looking for other things to blame. You know, so when I become cynical about my job, my boss, my colleagues, my organization, or worst case scenario, my customers, then I'm kind of putting the blame all on those. And when we're feeling cynical, that's what, you know, misery loves company. So we're going to start looking for other
Yeah.
people in the team who feel like me, trying to recruit others into this nasty, ugly space that we find ourselves in. And so how that manifests in organizations as gossip, you know,
Mm.
and bad mouthing everybody and everything, right? And
Yeah.
that's the one part of burnout that will spread. The rest of it's not contagious. In fact, it's not even a clinical condition. It's a phenomenon that can result in some mental health issues, but you can't go to the GP and get a diagnosis of burnout. It doesn't exist.
What's the remedy for burnout?
Well, to my mind, and what worked for me twice now that I can say I really experienced it. And the first time I knew nothing about it, and the second time I was I was working deeply in it. You know, the hypocrisy or the irony of expertise, right? But again, it was, I had poor boundaries because I was trying to get the message out to as many people as possible, and didn't listen to myself. I was a lab experiment of my own work.
It's totally okay. The mechanic's car is always broken.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the plumbers, taps leak, all the rest of it. So what does somebody do about it? Well, you see, the biggest problem, those three pillars I was talking about, you'll notice there's no mention of mental ill health anywhere in there.
Yeah.
It's kind of assumed, and very often organizations and individuals will actually look and say, teaspoon of cement, harden up, just get past it. To my mind, and I talk about emotions all the time, which is difficult being an aging white man, male, living in Byron Bay, talking about emotions. People just go, yeah, whatever. You know what I mean? But emotions and our emotional reaction and response to our environment is ever present. Every conscious behavior, decision, action we take is underpinned by a felt sense, some kind of an emotion or feeling, which is underpinned by some kind of need we have for environment. So how I describe that, I would say, I'm dehydrated, I feel thirsty, I'll go and get a drink, right?
Yeah.
So that's the process.
Yeah.
And with very few exceptions, that's how we all operate. So the emotion feelings drive behavior. The emotion comes first every time. So I look at burnout. Now, there's two things about this. It's actually an organizational problem, not a person problem. Jennifer Moss said that many years ago in one of her articles, and I think she was spot on. It's an organizational issue, not a personal one.
What does that mean?
So what we mean by that is it's not the person being incapable of being able to deal with their workload. It's actually the workload itself that's causing it.
Right.
Right. And that's the area that we have to that we have to look at. And that's what the psychosocial hazards area looks at, and the compliance looks at. Again, burnout is not one of the psychosocial hazards, but the effects that cause it are in there: job demand, job resources, lack of role clarity, bullying, etc., etc. These are all things that can result in burnout. So let's talk about what a person can do first. And to my mind, as I say, I firmly believe that emotions drive all of our behaviors. If you're feeling good and you're feeling well, you're going to perform well. If you're feeling less than, you're not going to produce to the same level. So your emotion, how you're feeling, is going to determine how you act and how you behave. And so, to my mind, burnout, and this can be a little bit controversial for some people, burnout is pretty much just suppressed emotions. I feel exhausted, but I'm going to push through. I feel a shame or guilt that I can't keep up. I'm not good enough. I have that sort of efficacy issue, or as I call abilities, because it's a word people recognize better. So, if I feel like I can't keep up, I'll keep pushing and pushing and pushing to try and get there. So I'll suppress that feeling of less than. And then I feel cynical. So I start sort of bad-mouthing the organization and looking for some allies in this space. But really what's going on is I've become apathetic. I've just lost caring.
Yeah.
And then when that happens, some mental health issues can arise. Anxiety, depression, procrastination is a low-lying anxiety response, if you like, right? So there are, if it's not addressed, there are mental health issues that can occur as a result of it. And so what we're not doing is we're not looking after ourselves. But what's the first thing we do then when we're feeling burnt out? We just remove any connection with other people. Too busy, I got to keep going. We remove, in my mind, the first thing we lose is what I would call play. We don't get play anymore, and we're snappy and we're introverted and we kind of retreat and withdraw into ourselves. And that's what other people will start to notice, but we won't see it in ourselves. So my antidote, if you like, for want of a better term, last time I burned out, I said, okay, well, this is wrong. No, I'm just, it's all work. It's no play. So I did two things, and I was going to do one of them anyway. I got a dog. Because I work in the mental health space, and I've always had a fascination with therapy animals.
Yeah.
Service dogs, if you like. And so I got Murphy, the golden retriever. We're training him up to be a therapy dog, a sort of a service companion type animal. Moderate success. He's a bit of an idiot, but we're getting there. And he's learning from the best as well. So I got to be mindful of that too. I can't blame him entirely. But so I got a dog. So suddenly I was walking twice a day, right? Getting more exercise, getting out, meeting people I wouldn't otherwise know in the neighborhood, and would become very pally now with all the other doggy owners. You know, the dog's names, not
Yeah.
the owners, but you're
Yeah.
all going to catch up and all that. And the other thing I did, I decided I needed a hobby. I needed something else. It was just a pure fluke meeting somebody who was taking his kids to archery because he did it as well. And I said, yeah, go along, just curiosity. And I was obsessed with archery. So then
Yeah.
suddenly I had introduced, I think, something like 17 hours I've worked out of new activities into my life at a time when I was burnt out and overwhelmed. And it worked a treat, and my work didn't suffer. I found the time for the new activities, but I was doing exercise, I was meeting new people, I was walking the dog, developing that relationship. I was trying something new. It was Zen-like, it was meditative, but it was also in company and it was exercise.
Yeah.
And best cure ever. So sometimes it's not take stuff away, it's actually add stuff in. And if you're going to do that, find something that's bloody fun. Get some fun back in your life if you're feeling burnout, because that's going to be the thing that'll lift you.
You say that bullying
Mm,
dominates workers' compensation claims, and
yes.
yeah, and burnout, however, is a far bigger issue. Why do you think that organizations misdiagnose burnout, and what does that misdiagnosis cost them, do you think?
Yeah. So, well, here's the thing, and it's probably even shifted now. I'm told Dr. Michelle McQuaid, University of Melbourne, her research is now telling us that poor change management is the number one mental health challenge in workplaces and teams today.
Is that right?
Yeah. And you know what? I'm not at all surprised, because
Yeah.
we're experiencing change and rapid change and rupture and risk and all of these things far faster than we have in the past. I mean, just look at the integration and introduction of AI.
Yeah.
The research says that 70% of change initiatives will fail. And it's not because of the technology or anything. It's the people stuff. It's too quick. It's too much. There's not enough information. We are xenophobic by nature, so we're going to fear and mistrust anything that needs to change. So I say to leaders all the time, if you're bringing a change process in, have a listen to the coffee conversations. If they're about backward facing, if they're about, why do things have to change? Why are they always doing this to us? Instead of, this could be really exciting, I wonder where this is going to take us.
Yeah.
Forward-facing conversations. You're going to struggle. So we need to, and the only way you're going to have forward-facing ones is give as much information as you can. I can't tell you any more than I've already told you is enough information for people to at least not join dots that aren't there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you think that workers' compensation claims are more attributable in a legal sense to an employer, whereas burnout is a bit of a grey area?
Well, see, burnout isn't listed in the psychosocial hazards, and possibly, I'm not really sure why, but I think it's possibly because it's not a diagnosable condition. You can't get a diagnosis to give to a workers' compensation claim. So it's got to be the outcomes of the burnout. Like we
Yeah.
were saying earlier on, that poor change management will cause that, absolutely. But some of the other issues that we talked about, lack of resources, lack of job demand, lack of control and autonomy or clarity, those are things that will cause people to burn out. And so when I released, it was either a white paper or it was some of the work I was doing. That's it. When psychosocial hazards legislation first rolled out, they said bullying was the number one mental health challenge. And I remember thinking, I don't think that's right. But I wasn't aware of the fact that burnout wasn't going to be listed as one.
Mm.
And I would be speaking at conferences and I would say, okay, hands up, who thinks bullying is your number one mental health challenge in the workplace? And not a hand will go up. Who thinks burnout is? And every hand in the room will shoot straight up in the air. So that always had me wondering. And so then, when we would dive into it and we would turn to the person next to you, let's have a chat and come back with some ideas we'd all love to share. And some smart people said, look, the reason why bullying seems to be registering is very often something along the lines of an employee We've lost 3 team members and we're all expected to do more with less now,
Yeah.
which incidentally you can't do anymore with the psychosocial hazards legislation. But that was the kind of going line. We're going to do more with less. We're tightening our belts and all of that. And somebody would ask their boss for some direction, but the boss was already stretched and overwhelmed and would maybe snap at them. Or they'd get feedback that says they're not keeping up because they didn't know what was expected of them. And that would register as bullying. They would call that, I'm being bullied because there's nothing I do seems to be right, but I'm not getting any direction. And the bullying claim would sort of go in because leaders would have a performance conversation with them. And they very often, I'd say the number one question I get asked is, how do you switch from a caring, well-being conversation into a performance one? Because very often, you got to
Mm.
segue into the other one.
Mm.
And it's at the intersection of that very often this sort of charge or claim of bullying will come up. I'm being bullied because, I don't know what they want from me. And when I ask for any kind of clarity, I don't get it, and so I'll put in a bullying claim. You know what I
But
mean?
you have to hold people accountable.
No, totally you do. Well, yeah, there's managing and there's leading, and you got to do both, I think, You
Yeah.
got to manage the business and you got to lead your people and
You
manage your people sometimes. Yeah, you have to
you
sometimes do both.
you work at the intersection of
Mm,
psychology and performance, which is
mm,
is really quite fascinating because there are things happening on both of those spectrums or perspectives. How
yeah.
can a leader tell? And this is when I was thinking about this conversation today, it's
Mm,
what made me think about this kind of bell curve of burnout.
yeah.
But how can a leader tell the difference between a performance problem and a mental health problem? And what should change in their approach once they know which one they're facing?
Yeah. We're probably starting in the middle of the question with that. And so
Yeah.
I look, I think I'm a very big fan of the concept of psychological safety, which can require vulnerability in the leader. Now, some leaders will say, no, you'll lose control of your team if you are completely and utterly vulnerable because, one of the hyenas in your team will come and try and push you from the top spot because you're showing weakness. We
Yeah.
hear these sorts of actions all the time. And look, I don't know enough to say whether that's right or wrong for somebody's situation. But I do know that unless your team feels safe enough to trust in you and in the team that they'll be okay, you'll never unpack whether somebody is actually struggling in some way, shape, or form with their mental health challenge or challenges. Um, and when they don't feel safe enough to speak up, when they need some kind of support and get the team to rally around them, as a leader, you're going to be fighting against the tide because you just won't know what's happening.
Yeah.
No, I say to leaders all the time, the biggest fears they have is, what if I say the wrong thing? What if are there legal ramifications to me giving advice? First of all, no, Samaritan Act, exists around the world. If you're doing whatever you're doing is in the right reasons and for the right sort of motivations, then, if you're trying to support somebody, you cannot be held sort of liable for it. So that's the first point. And there is no kind of tort law that would say that they could take against a leader. But my line to leaders always is, you're not counselors, you're not chaplains, you're not expected to have the answers. This is the one time as a leader you're not expected to have the answers for somebody's challenges. But you can create a safe space, right? And if that's all you do, that actually is enough. Because in doing that, you're empowering that person to seek the support and help they need, knowing that they're safe enough to do so now. They got the leaders back, which means that the team has their back. And so they're not going to be victimized or savaged for actually experiencing some kind of distress. And the more prevalent these issues become through experiences like rapid change that we experience, the more necessary it is. I share with leaders all the time, if you could just draw a pie chart sort of in front of us now, there's nearly 100 years of research goes into what I'm about to tell you. And it's looking at the common factors in people's recovery from mental health illness,
Mhm.
mental health challenges, or mental ill health, I suppose, to be most accurate. And what we call social capital, in other words, the level of support somebody has from their environment. So, siblings, parents, partner, colleagues, friends, leaders, and organization, that the support that surrounds them represents about 40% of the likelihood of recovery.
Mm.
And when they feel like it's okay to not be okay, it feels like it's okay to not be okay for a bit, or, I feel safe enough that I can trust these people with my vulnerabilities while I find some recovery. If I feel that, then that 40% has got me entrenched. We're nearly halfway there. That gives a sense of hope, right? Sense of hope's worth about 30% of the likelihood of recovery. So now
Mm.
if you just look at the pie chart, and we're now at 70%, and no one's talked about treatment or
Yeah.
doctors or pills or anything yet, but just the conditions we create to support someone is enough. And we're not telling anyone how to get better, etc. The other 30% then is split between the type of treatment they receive, the fact that they look after themselves and their self-care improves and they get better sleep and they reach out with people and they start to eat better and drink less and all of those things that we do when we're trying to recover. And then the relationship with their clinician is worth about 15%, something like that. So leaders, and especially leaders in organizations like your audience, where, not everybody's totally anonymous. Do you know what I mean? That
Yeah.
it's almost like the ideal size of our community is 150 people. There's a whole psychological idea around that. But when you're not anonymous, you can create that. A leader can create that environment and influence as much as 70% of the likelihood of recovery, without ever, without talking about treatments or anything like that. We're empowering the person to find the solution for themselves. And if that's all we do, that is fantastic. That's a really, really good outcome.
So is that,
So if sorry, there's a very
yeah.
long-winded way of getting
No,
to the idea that if we create that sort of environment, then we can have the conversations with somebody around, supporting whatever it is they need to do. And when you're doing that for a while, if performance doesn't lift, you're in a much better position to say, look, I know you're struggling and we're giving you as much support as we possibly can. But the team has KPIs that are now starting to struggle. I have KPIs that I have to meet. The business actually has to still perform. What do you think we can do to deliver on your work? And what do you think you need from us to help you to deliver on your work? Because something has to shift here now.
yeah.
You know what I mean? That's not bad feedback of a job. Well, that person cannot say you're bullying me. I said, no, I've been supporting you for the last month. We've been carrying the can, but something has to shift. What do you think we can do? And still involving and empowering them in what needs to happen. But what leaders can't do is say, I call in HR and say, this person has to go. I've tried everything. And, as their leader, you have to carry that conversation. It's not HR's job to have it. They can support you in what needs to happen. But if you say, out of my hands, it's over to HR now, you break any trust you have with them. And not only that, your team will see that you've just thrown them to the wolves, if you like. And if my leader can do that to that person, they could do it to me. And now any team cohesion you had, it's kind of gone, So leaders have to remain in that conversation and lead it, in my opinion.
What do you think is the difference between management and leadership?
Of people? To my mind, and actually, here's a phrase I think we were talking about before you pressed record. We're talking about success. What does success look like? And from a management perspective, success is a number. It's an outcome. It's a result. In a leadership phrase, or to the team, success is actually a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
We feel successful. We produce results. God, we're good together, aren't we? What a team we've got. Let's do it again next quarter. You know what I mean? And so leading people through whatever adversity they're experiencing is a skill set that takes more than just managing the business or managing the people. So that's, to my mind, it's the kind of the human bit. And look, that's how I differentiate it. You manage the business, you lead the people. That's kind of where I take it, if you like. And an absolute place for both.
And so in management, where you're focused on a number, does that change the definition of a safe space at all, as you defined it moments ago?
It's a very good question. I would think they're interrelated, aren't they? It's a
Yeah.
bit like we were saying work-life balance, the management leadership balance. I think they're integrated. I don't know if you can unwrap them from each other.
Well, they're critical, right?
Absolutely they are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, absolutely they are. Yeah. Does
Okay.
that answer your question? I'm not,
It
maybe not.
does. I guess in the world that we play, we look at there being a distinction between management and leadership, where leaders is a bit more human. Leadership is a
Yeah,
little
I
bit
think
more
so.
human. Management is a bit more, I guess, by the book and
Mm,
constrained.
yeah.
I don't have a specific definition, despite the fact that I raised it. Uh,
No, but you've just raised what it is. There's some ideas coming up in my head. And we talk about emotionally intelligent leaders are far
mm,
more valuable, and 98% of founders, which would be your audience, would value emotional intelligence in their senior leadership over sort of ordinary IQ, for one,
yeah,
garden variety
for
intelligence, for
sure.
want of a better term. But I think there's another step beyond that again. And it's what what I call relational intelligence. And so by that, I mean, look at the dance, not just the dancers, right? So we have to look at what's being created. So when we're experiencing rapid change, and we all are, let's face it, the leader who can hold that space of rupture or discomfort so that it can sort of play out the way it needs to is going to be the leader who will be trusted far more than the one that glosses over things. I'd prefer a leader who's present over perfect, right? There is a sort of a kind of a natural instinct to gloss over things and move past them, but very often it is in holding that sort of space and looking at the emotional sort of atmosphere, if you like, of the team. I did warn you I speak about emotions, so
You're in
you know
good company, my friend.
excellent. Thanks, Brad. So to my mind, like I often talk about the soundtrack of your team. What's the soundtrack like today? So, if you're watching a scary movie and
Yeah,
you turn down the sound, it's not nearly as scary. And if you put clown music in, you'd have a totally different movie again, right? So it's about what's going on in the background. What's that mist that's engulfing us all? Because that's what's going to give you your outcome, and that's telling you what the performance is going to be like. Because the feelings will drive the behavior, not just of the individuals but of the team. And
yeah,
so a leader needs to be able to just sit in that uncomfortableness, whatever it might be, just to sort of figure it out so that everybody can find their footing again. And that's relational intelligence. So it's psychological safety, it's emotional intelligence, and then it's this idea of holding the atmosphere. And I think that makes a really good leader, rather than the one who jumps in to rescue and save everybody. I remember when I was training as a clinician, one of my supervisors once, because I was doing that in one supervised session. And afterwards, I remember my supervisor saying, "How dare you?" And I said, "What? I thought I did really well. How dare you rob them of their experience?"
mm,
And it sat me back in my ass. I was going, "Wow, yeah, okay, I see what you mean." And he was going, "Look, what they were going to learn, you can't save them from what they're going to experience. You just have to shine the light in it. And the work they do is not what happens in the room here. The work they do is going to be what's happening outside." So I was creating the soundtrack for what that occurrence was going to be like. And I can't go in and play the part. And so it's the same for leaders. Sometimes we just got to hold that uncertainty. There's a change process happening, and when isn't there? But there's so much going on, and to just hold that uncomfortableness so that people can just sit carefully in it and safely.
yeah.
Does that make sense?
So there's
And that's
news.
leading, not managing. That's leading then.
Yeah, and I think there is a distinction. There is new legislation around psychosocial hazard laws, which shifts the onus from we didn't know to we should have known. And you, in particular, talk about the very important role that middle layer leaders have in as a responsibility in this arena. Why is this layer, the middle managers, so important, and how should organizations prepare them?
Okay, really good question. And not everybody would agree that that's where it lies. But in my mind, so if you've got people who are involved in risk management, etc., they'll know the bow tie model.
Yep.
So you think picture of a bow tie, a little knot, but then the two things fan out sort of both directions. So that's kind of events and outcomes, etc. And the middle management that seem to sort of that it sort of hinges on. I think the reason why the legislation is very different now is it's a legal term called a reasonable mistake of fact. So we didn't know was not a defense in court anymore. It's a bit like, the cyber security challenges Optus and Medibank, etc. is facing.
Yeah.
And we didn't know we could be attacked. And well, the answer is, it's your business. You should have known the potential that it could happen. And so what's shifted in the legislation now is the difference between reckless and negligent. So to prove in work health and safety, to prove reckless behavior, it's like you threw that glass of water in front of them and made them slip, or you knew that stepladder was broken and still you let them use it. That's reckless. You willfully did or didn't do something to prevent an accident. Negligent just basically says you should have been aware that this could be a problem. And so not only has the burden of proof shifted from reckless to negligent, saying no, the only proof needed is negligence, that's kind of the burden of proof is now reversed.
Yeah.
So, they don't need to prove knowledge anymore. You must show that you did what you did to prevent harm. You're expected to have known it was a problem. So that's now the onus that lies on, we'll say, the board of an organization. Now, Sidney Yoshida, if we're talking risk, has that great the iceberg of ignorance model, which I prefer to call the iceberg of innocence, because very often when you're talking about mental ill health, we couldn't have known. It's not tangible. You can't see it. But in that iceberg model, they say 4% is above the waterline. So that's the board's knowledge of mental health challenges in the workplace. The next layer down is the kind of what we call executive level or C-suite people, the chief, whatever. And they get to hear of about 9 or 10% of the challenges, deal with at least half of them before some have to be reported to the board for due diligence, etc. But below the C-suite, the 9 or 10% is the middle management. And they get to understand about 50, maybe 60% of the psychosocial hazards that their people face. Now, very often they've come from the front line up into that space, or they've come in from the sides.
And they have those relationships.
Yeah, they have those relationships. But remember, we're still dealing with people who feel stigma and shame and who won't speak up, even, because it's an evolutionary thing. I'm not going to expose myself as being the weakest in the tribe. I could be savage, so I'll say nothing and I'll just struggle on regardless. So even though they have a great level of empathy for their people, they're probably not across everything that's going on unless they create the psychological safety that it allows everyone on the front line who experience 100% of the challenges to be able to sort of speak up and bring it to their attention. So the middle management it's kind of what I say, it's the shift from people who work on the business, the forward planning, the blue sky stuff, to the ones who are working in the business, who are in daily contact with their people. To my mind, that's where it hinges. That's the knot in the bow tie, because they're the ones who are going to find out what's going on. And usually, if they know 50 to 60%, but C-suite only get to know 10%, they're doing an excellent job of managing the expectations and managing the support around it, but could be done better when there is a deeper level of safety and trust and a sense of belonging that people have. So that's why I talk about middle management being I think this is where it's going to really work. No, it's never going to work unless they're getting the support from on high. But I think that's why the psychosocial hazards, the legislation has shifted the burden of proof to negligence rather than recklessness. They've redefined what a PCBU, a person who controls a business or undertaking. It's kind of shifted their definition, if you like. So they're bringing a lot more people in that should be smarter at knowing what's going on, and in order to sort of become compliant with the legislation. And as we were saying earlier, before we hit record, I think, when we were just chatting, compliance, I reckon, is half the story. And it's a very short leap from compliance to performance in a team.
Because you must comply, but there is an opportunity around performance if you continue down that path.
I think it's really not a big jump.
Yeah.
So to be compliant with the legislation, it says there's 4 things you have to do.
Yeah.
You have to identify the hazards.
Yeah.
Now, there are a couple of different ways of doing that, and I've often looked at what's the most effective way of doing it and what's the cheapest way of doing it. And most organizations then look for what that sweet spot is. Interestingly, the most effective is also the cheapest, and that is to run some kind of a pulse survey. It's a 40 questions around
Yep.
the 14 psychosocial hazards, or 17 for Comcare now. But and there's more to come, because AI is creating some hazards that weren't part of the code of practice when it was
Yeah.
written, right? So there's a bunch of questions you can ask your people, and you can be structured in such a way, like it's some organizations will say, we'll ask the questions, but we want to drill down as close as we can to maybe the nearest 5 people in the survey, so that we can identify if there's bullying, who the bullies are. And I'm saying, no, that's not the purpose of the survey. That's a witch hunt. That's not
Yeah.
a wellbeing survey, right?
Yeah.
If we identify bullying as a problem in your organization, we can look for who it is later. What that's telling us is we have a culture of bullying in our organization. That's all the information we need right now. That's what we need to address and need to fix. Who's doing it? We'll find out in the fullness of time.
Yeah.
But I think we just have to acknowledge and say, this is a psychosocial hazard. And as a board, or as a C-suite, or a business owner, I want to know that that's going on. I'll figure out who it is, but let's just make
Yeah.
it uncomfortable for them to do it, first of all, right? And so there's a process to becoming compliant, is identify the hazards. It's cheap, it's not difficult, and the rest of it just flows from there. Then you assess so this is a hazard, but how severe is it? How often does it happen, and how long does it last? Okay, well, now that we know that, we can prevent it, or at least mitigate it. And then we can just continually review our process to make sure we're on top of it. But step one, get that right, the rest of it just falls into place. Now, you can imagine if you're shifting from sort of careless to compliant and competent as an organization, your leaders in that process are learning about their people, they're learning about the business. So they're shifting from being kind of complacent or cautious about it to kind of comfortable having these conversations, and then confident in leading their team. Now, a team might feel it kind of missed or dissed, even, if you like, in a psychologically unsafe environment. But when they feel like they're seen and heard, and they're asked for their opinion, and they're allowed to share, they feel like they belong. So you could
Yeah.
the whole culture now is just shifting from a kind of a tense organization into something that's thriving. And so when when you do the compliance bit, leaders get better, teams get more comfortable, culture will shift. You're on your next step is performance. How can we just get better at what we're doing? How is everyone feeling?
Yeah. If you were advising a mid-market owner-led company, what 3 questions would you ask them about the mental health of their workforce?
Right. Probably the same 3 questions that Safe Work would ask you if they walked in the door, or WorkSafe would ask you.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what their 3 questions are. So anybody who's saying, oh, we don't really want to run a survey, we've done too many pulse surveys, people get bored of them, I think, yeah, we'll do focus groups instead. And I say, you're never going to be able to answer the first question that the inspector will ask when they walk in the door. And that they will say, how have you identified the hazards that your people are facing? If you fall short of saying, we asked everybody, then you're never going to make compliance. Now,
Yeah.
51% might answer because they're bored of doing pulse surveys, but that's robust enough to qualify. But if we haven't even asked them what's going on in their world, in their working world, then how can we ever create a policy that addresses the legislation, or a strategy to deliver on our policy, or even the actionables to try and deliver a strategy? So how have you identified the hazards? That's the first thing they'll ask you. What are you doing to prevent them or control them is going to be the next obvious one, right? So what's your risk assessment? What's your control measures, etc.? And then the third question that SafeWork will ask is, do your people know how to report an issue? Is it clear the process that they follow, right? And then, things like, do you have an ongoing review, etc.? So those are the 3 things I would say an organization should think about. How do we know what's troubling our people? What are we doing about it? And again, remember, it's insofar as is reasonably practicable. I have this running gag when people say to me, well, what if they say, 2 weeks in Fiji and I should feel better? And my line is, well, I'd like a 30-inch waist. I don't think either of us are going to get what we're asking for, right? So
Yeah.
insofar as it's reasonably practicable, and don't make it any more complicated than it needs to be. And I've spent a long time with inspectors, lawyers, prosecutors, auditors, workers' compensation people, safe work people, a long time asking the sorts of questions. What are you looking for?
Yeah.
And they come back and they say, look, we have no interest in prosecuting an individual unless the individual has gone out of their way to harm somebody. Right, we'd much rather book a business because the fine will be 4 times higher, and the what do you call it? The publicity will be so much higher. That's
Yeah.
what they'd be after, right? And don't forget, Safe Work New South Wales issued over 700 compliance notices in 3 days just at the end of last month. So they're on a blitz, and everybody's going to follow suit.
Yeah.
130 of those were for psychosocial sort of
Wow.
challenges, if you like. Yeah, they're not kidding around with this thing. They're getting serious. But so I asked them, what are they looking for, and they just say, keep it simple. If we come in to inspect somebody's strategy or somebody's responses, and they remove a 30-page document from the back of the filing cabinet, and it's pristine, we're immediately suspicious. The ink is probably still wet on those pages. But if we walk in and we see a psychosocial hazard, a bullying challenge or something, if we see a 1-page document that's covered in coffee stains and dog-eared and all the rest of it, we know at least people are reading it. And so what it looks like is, here is a psychosocial hazard that either we've identified or we haven't, but this is what it's about. This is what the hazard is. This is what the organization expects from you. This is what you can expect from the organization. And this is how you report a problem.
Yeah.
That shouldn't take more than a page. In fact, I've had some auditors say that should be 5 bullet points. And if you can get it down to that, people will read it and they know that they're okay. But a 30-page document, nobody's going to read,
What's a book that you would recommend for our audience?
Ooh, okay. My latest hero, I think, would be Mark C. Crowley. And look, there's a reason why. He is a huge advocate of well-being over performance, or over engagement, I should say, as a measure. And we both think along the same lines. I think engagement, we've been measuring it for the last 10, 12 years, and it hasn't shifted even through COVID and everything else that's happened here.
Yeah.
And hybrid working and working from home, remote working, and all of the different things. It's kind of fairly static, right? It hasn't shifted. And it can be argued, and in fact, Harvard have done research that seems to show that engagement is a lagging indicator, most likely, and it could be the outcome of success rather than the causation of it.
Mm-hmm.
And both, Mark C. Crowley is far more elegant and eloquent at saying these things, but his line is, well-being is a better predictor of success. And if you look after your people, they will look after the business. Now, Virgin, Richard Branson, I worked for him for Virgin in the very late, early 90s. And they had like that whole work-life integration thing down pat even then. Like, that's what, 30-something years ago, And so I think it's, looking after your people, the rest of it will take care of itself, kind of thing, right? And well-being is not just fruit on the Friday. If that's your response to well-being, then you're so far behind. So Mark C. Crowley has 2 books.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is Lead from the Heart, which might sound a little bit washy or woolly or whatever, but actually when you read it, he talks about how the heart has 40,000 different synapses, and it actually can mitigate, and it can cause emotional responses and reactions in the brain. It sort of has a direct line to the autonomic nervous system as part of our central nervous system.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean just lead from the heart, it's all lovey-dovey. It actually means that, heartfelt responses, and I feel it in my heart. These have been sayings like for, millennia, I guess. And it's a wonderful way that he defines leadership. Doesn't all have to be about facts and figures, is kind of the thing. And he's just written another book, and I'm waiting for it to arrive in the mail, but I know it's going to be a beauty, and that's The Power of Employee Wellbeing. So he and I swim in the same lane.
Mm.
He's far faster swimmer than I am, and he's worth seeking out He's got a brilliant podcast as well, just like yourself, and is very proactive on, social media, LinkedIn, etc.
How can people learn more about you and the good work that you do?
Probably my website would be the first place to go. Follow me on LinkedIn. I'm fairly prolific on there insofar as it's useful anymore. It seems to have changed over the last couple of years. Everybody sort of seems to have the same conversation. But, I'm still there. I share newsletters and blogs and my latest thinking on there. My website's kind of got everything I'm up to. I update it every so often. I try to have my website looking at, where I see myself in 6 months' time kind of thing. But all of the programs I do, so I just talk about, I help people work better together. That's kind of my tagline. If I ever get a tattoo, and I haven't yet, but if I ever do, it'd probably say something like that. And so, it's about better people in the organization, better leaders for the people, and better teams. So it's helping all of those to work better together. That's my life's purpose, Brad.
Wonderful.
Jump my website, follow me on LinkedIn. My email is mark@markbutler.au. Very simple. And yeah, you'll find me. I'm not hiding anywhere.
Mark, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. Very engaging conversation and on a really, really important topic. Much appreciated.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review for the podcast, that'd be really helpful to other like-minded entrepreneurs, and then we can grow our community. If you want to find out more about our guests, head over to evolutionpartners.com.au/podcast, where you can find show notes and other additional reading. Hope to see you back next week. Until then, keep thriving.